Hello and welcome. I am Nicholas St. Pierre. I am Chief Technology Officer here at Agilicus, and you're joining me with a platform showcase today. We are going to explore how to secure remote access for water facilities. This is part of our series of platform showcases where we dive a little bit deeper into specific use case that encompass Zero Trust in the Agilicus NEX platform. So as we get started here, please follow me along. We'll have a live demo today, and we will be looking at exactly how we can implement security parameters around Zero Trust and encompass what I see as regularly used technology like VNC, HMIs, and the visibility that we can do with this while providing extra layers of security through the NEX platform. So, like I mentioned, I'm your host, Nicholas St. Pierre, and we will dive into this today. We will first look a little bit more about what is Zero Trust. How does Agilicus approach the Zero Trust concept using things like identity and identity providers and federation? We will look at how we can then tie those identities, who you are and what you have, to things like resources that otherwise have no concept of, for example, username, password, identities, or multi-factor, or permissions, and how we can make these very secure in existing OT technologies such as water purification plant and water treatment plants. We'll look at existing use cases that I see across the industry today, which is fairly simple, an HMI that people need remote access to view or interact with multiple possibilities. And we'll specifically look at a workstation that operates multiple dashboards, which we'll make available individually. We'll see how we can share these HMI views, but also share different levels of permission into these individual HMIs and assign these roles to identity, where users can either be allowed to interact directly with the functionality of the HMI, or simply have a viewer role where they can observe a graph, for example, or a set of plots or sensors. And that will allow them to then distribute to multiple users simultaneously multiple dashboards residing on one workstation while isolating the portions of those HMIs. So let's look at what Zero Trust does in IT and in operational technology, and what I mean when I talk about identity and resources and authorization. So to us, Zero Trust is based on three things that we need to do whenever we want to have access to a resource, a system, a network, and so on. The first one is fairly well understood: identity, who I am, what I know, what I have. When we talk about multi-factor, each individual must be individually authenticated, even if they use, for example, shared accounts across an older facility or legacy systems, for example, or a system that has no password. I need to be able to identify and audit who that person is. The second one is we need to authorize through role-based what level of authorization I'm going to give that identity to a resource. I need to be able to assign permission and privileges where maybe none exist today, either because it's a legacy system or the system is just not built with multiple roles, for example. And the third one is access, and that's an important one with us here at Agilicus, is how do I route to this destination without using a VPN? How do I only expose resources that people are authorized for? And how can I monitor that access through an audit system, for example, for governance, risk management, or compliance purposes? So let's start digging a little bit deeper. Identity. Each person in our system uses their identity to log into the system or get access to a resource and demonstrate who they are first. What that means is we do not rely on new credentials to be issued. That can be tiresome, a little bit of a toil for administrators as well, to provision new seats in our Active Directory or new identity to contractors and so on. Our system integrates directly with shared identity providers or IDPs, local identity providers such as Active Directories, ERP systems, for example, or even Windows local users. Regardless of where your employer is, whether you're working for the water treatment plant facility in this example today that we're going to look into, or you're a contractor, or you're a one-off seasonal worker, you continue to use your identity. We can also implement multi-factor and require that on top of what the identity provider, think Microsoft or Google, requires. This means I can enlist someone with a personal Hotmail or Outlook account, but then I force them to do multi-factor. We'll do that today as well. Based on that identity then, with Zero Trust, we can create authorization rules. We can say this identity has access to this resource and not a network, a resource per user, per time, per agenda, per network, for example. And I need to have detailed granular audit to understand both from a risk management, what the behavior of the user is, but where they go. What this means is because we're not allowing network to be shared or network to be accessed, we don't rely on a VPN or virtual private network. It also means we're not dependent on IP-based policies. We can have overlapping IPs of resources, think HMIs or PLCs, in different water treatment plants across a municipal government network, and still be able to reach them at the same time because we're not dependent on layer 3 VPN routing, for example. From a security posture perspective, very important that we are not opening ports on our firewall for inbound access, regardless of whether we have one device that we're sharing or hundreds of devices. The Agillicus NEX component called the connector only ever connects outbound from our premises and does so over a known IP address over port 443 using generally accepted protocols like TLS, for example, which is the only protocols that we accept. So it makes it extremely useful to have a clean security posture or security hygiene. Here is solved from an IT perspective. We don't have to do ACL or access controls lists or exceptions in our firewall to allow the reachability. So when we combine all of this on the identity side of the solution, we see that we can implement with multiple federated identities at the same time out of the box. I can authenticate to anyone that has an identity powered by Microsoft. Think something like Office 365, Azure AD, or much simpler, something like Skype, for example, or Outlook. I can also do it through Google G Suite and multiple other providers. I get to choose the identity that I'm going to allow into my system as long as they can provide the sufficient credentials separately with that identity provider. And we'll see that today as well. That means I don't have no user IDs to input in my system to track the activity or actives users in my Active Directory or my user repository. And my users don't have new passwords to learn. Users can bring their own device to browse, in this case HMIs, for example, and do so from their phone without having a new client, no VPN. I can layer multi-factor authentication, and I can enable single sign-on where I choose to and where it makes sense from a security perspective. From the access side of Zero Trust, like I mentioned, from a security posture, I want this to be clean. I want to be able to only allow a single well-known connection out to the NEX platform, regardless of the number of users, regardless of the types of resources that I'm making available. I want to keep all of my resources on my secure network off the public internet. That means two things. First is I don't expose any ports on my firewall that would reach any device inside my network. That includes the connector itself because it only connects outbound. But I can keep all of my resources air-gapped. They do not need to have internet access, and sometimes they shouldn't have internet access. They shouldn't be routable out of my firewall out to the internet. This goes for HMIs, for example, for applications, for PLCs that are deployed in my secure network that I don't want to have any chance of them reaching out and downloading, for example, a malware payload. I can segment all the resources. Like I mentioned, I'm not exposing, or I don't want to expose network-based resources. I get to decide which device specifically is exposed to the user and not a network. And that gives me enhanced security, the ability to protect in the cloud any access to my infrastructure and implement role-based access control policies. Today we'll look at fairly well-established tooling, VNC, virtual network computing, for example. In its most basic essence, the ability to get the frame buffer or the video feed from a remote computer and grab the mouse and keyboard and input data or move the mouse and click about as if I were at the terminal. A little bit different than the traditional Microsoft remote desktop protocol where I need to log in with a username and participate in the Windows authentication sequence. However, as simple as VNC is, it does generally have some gaps. First one is the protection of the security of the access for read-write or read-only is password protected. That password is quite weak. We don't want to expose that on the internet, and we won't today either. I don't necessarily have access to full credentials here. I have very easy read-write password or full administrator password or viewer password. But now I'm able to actually implement user identity on top of VNC with the Agilicus system. So I don't need to define new extensive security policies for VNC if it's already running on my network. There's obviously been concerns about exposing that to the internet, so I'm not going to route VNC on the internet as such. And I'm going to be very specific as to who has access to VNC and how I'm going to grant them access at what level without sharing any of those VNC credentials to the user. I'm going to decide in the platform whether a user can use VNC in an operator mode, which means they can interact with the remote system, or in a viewer mode where they may only be allowed, for example, to observe a graph or supervise the activity of someone else on that terminal. When I do that, then I am pairing security with identity. I can know at any given time in VNC who the person is that is viewing it, which is otherwise not possible with VNC. It's a simple network-based technology. I either have access or not. I can then implement things like MFA on top of VNC. I can allow someone to look at a terminal, but first I need them to do their two-factor authentication. So now I have the ability that I've paired very basic resources that are traditionally present in my water treatment facility with advanced security posture tooling to understand who's an employee, who's a vendor, who's a contractor, who's seasonal, and who's looking at what. And I get to control that from a central location with a very easy to understand workflow. So in today's showcase, I'm going to walk through the motion live. Hopefully we don't have any problems. But I'm going to first go and demonstrate my identity. I'm going to log in with my personal Google account, my Gmail account. And then I'm going to access a portal, a user and portal for the organization, where I will be exposed to the types of resources that I have access to. And some of them will be HMIs. And those HMIs will be delivered over VNC. And those HMIs will reside internally into a network over a Windows 11 machine, but it's a dual screen machine and there's multiple HMIs running there, and I will actually segment the areas that I am allowing a user to view through the Agilicus platform. I'm going to define these areas in VNC, I'm going to protect them with Agilicus, I'm going to require then MFA or access to an identity provider to then view these areas or these HMIs. So let's look at the showcase. I have an identity. I'm going to traverse through the Agilicus NEX platform. On the secure network part, I have a workstation running VNC with HMIs on it. It does not have internet access. What it does have is reachability to the local Agilicus connector. That connector from Agilicus only ever connects outbound over port 443 using TLS to our cloud platform, regardless of the number of users or the types of applications or protocols that I am sharing on that secure network. The connector also does not participate in routing or forwarding. It does not listen. If you scan the machine or the device where it's installed, it's not listening, so it doesn't have a port open. It only ever establishes two flows, one to the back of our cloud, and through network segmentation, it initiates connections to resources on a secure network that could be air-gapped, for example. So that's basically the topology that we have today. When we look at the HMIs we're going to use today, it's one that I see often being used. Often in a water treatment facility or water purification plant, we will have a set of workstations that are running HMIs. And sometimes there's more than one on the workstation, and it's incumbent on the municipal government or IT network to make this available remotely for observation. Either a contractor needs to observe the status of some valves or pumps, for example, or needs to be able to click around and open those valves or view the status of temperatures and so on. In this example, we're looking at a two-screen workstation, so it's quite wide, onto which I have multiple HMIs. And on that workstation, I am running a version of VNC called Tight VNC. Tight VNC allows me to define areas of the desktop that I can make available. So by default, I could share both screens as I see now. I could share one screen, but I could share also the pixel area as its own desktop that I want to make available. What it doesn't have is the concept of users. It doesn't have the concept of who can look at what. It may have two roles built in. One is an operator role or read-write. The other one is a read-only or viewer role only. But it does not know how to attribute it other than by port and by password. We don't want to share these passwords. What we're going to do then is use the NEX platform and use a role-based capability to assign it to users. So in today's demo, I have defined 3 dashboards. They're HMIs. One of them has a graphical only interface, and I'll show you how they're delimited. That's my dashboard number 1. My dashboard number 2 is the full operator controls. I can see the graphical interface, but I can also open and close valves by clicking on them, which I can't do in the graphical one. So number 1 here, I can only view. I have no ability to interact. I can supervise what's happening on the screen. And the second one, like I mentioned, I can click around and enable close valves, monitor temperature set point, and change those temperature set points as well. In the third HMI, I am simply graphing water temperature and the set point that is set in the second dashboard. So depending on which one I choose, I am logging into a very specific area of that workstation to view that report. Also, depending on which identity I have, the administrator has given me either full operational control of that desktop or view-only role in that desktop where I can only observe what is going on. In the middle here, we see tight VNC, the little green logo, where I've identified the areas, and we'll see that in the next slide in much bigger detail. I've identified the pixel areas in which service those are assigned to, but I've named them graphical HMI, full panel HMI, and temperature HMI. And you see the red dotted line here is the outline that I'm only going to allow the visibility to be available through the platform. And that's through a definition in the VNC configuration for ports, where I'm defining an area, the offset on the screen, and the size of that area with a very specific port that tight VNC is allowing connectivity to. We also see in the HMI permission in the middle that I am forcefully not allowing anyone to connect to VNC other than localhost. That means that the only way to reach this workstation desktop is to VNC from within the house, so to speak. And the reason for that is that's where the connector, the Agillicus connector, is running on that machine. It's going to connect locally to that machine using VNC and try to grab these graphical areas. So this VNC server is locked down. Even adjacent machines on the same network, workstations that are right next to it, cannot connect to it because VNC is not listening on the public network or even the network interface on the secure network. It is only listening on the loopback interface. So therefore, only the workstation itself can connect to itself. By virtue of this, it is isolated. The only system that can now reach these devices is the Agillicus connector through our NEX platform. So let's look at what that looks like. I'm going to log in with my identity. I'm going to prove who I am. I'm going to use MFA. I'm going to be assigned, like I mentioned, 3 HMIs on the same workstation. Depending on my role, I'll be assigned either a viewer role or full ownership role. And then I'll show you how we implement MFA outside of my identity provider, in this case, Google G Suite. So let's take a look at this. So I'm going to share my my screen here, and it will come up shortly. I'm going to stay on the screen here with you. I think we're all seeing the screen now. So what I'll do here is demonstrate the end user portal of the Agillicus NEX platform on a personal organization that I've created under my personal domain. So I'm going to sign in, and immediately I am presented with a branded white labeled interface which represent my organization. I can have my logos, my colors, and so on, and I get to choose the identity provider that I make available for users. In this case, I can choose to log in through a local Windows machine somewhere on that network that has a valid username, and if I can provide a valid username, I can be allowed in. So they don't have to all be cloud-based internet identity providers. But I see that I've enabled also anything that is Google and anything that is Microsoft as well. So Azure, Skype, Office 365, and so on. When I sign in with Google here, my browser, and as many of you have done, are presented with the previous identity that this browser is aware of. And here I could choose to specify another identity, or in this case, I'll use my personal identity. Notice in the address bar that I'm doing this transaction directly with Google. Agillicus NEX at this point is completely at arm's length, waiting for Google to verify your identity. The same is true if I had chosen Microsoft as an identity provider. I will choose Google, and because I've signed into my Gmail account previously, it doesn't ask me for my password. Also doesn't ask me for my multi-factor on my phone because I've done so previously with this browser, and Google has cleared me out and allowed me through the Agillicus platform. Agillicus, though, as a security policy that I've implemented as the administrator, that I do require MFA, regardless of the identity provider. Here, the available methods are the TOTP, or the time-sensitive one-time password that I can enter here and do my authentication code. I could use my Microsoft Authenticator, my Google Authenticator, Authy, as long as I set it up. I can also register hardware devices. That could be USB YubiKeys, for example, could be your mobile phone, which is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to verify my two-factor authentication through my mobile phone, and the device that I have registered in the platform is my little 5G phone here with me. And when I do so, it's checking with my device. And I don't know if you can see here, but it's actually asking me to unlock my phone with my thumbprint. So this will be my second factor for today. So I am unlocking my phone, and my phone now is providing the second factor authentication. I am now entering a portal that has a lot of applications, file shares, and SSH available to me. But today we're looking at the HMIs. So I can navigate to HMI here. I can use a native VNC client on my workstation, but the Agillicus NEX platform also has a web-based integrated VNC client. So I see here the administrator has made a couple of desktops available to me, myself. I have the 3 HMIs that I've been mentioning about that we'll see today. I have the full-on desktop, the dual screen one, where I've drawn out these specific areas that I want to behave as HMIs report. And I have an ignition designer here from my SCADA systems. So let's start with the first one. So for the graphical HMI here, I am granted access to this desktop. It is the top left portion of my dual screen workstation. And I have read-only access to this HMI. As soon as I click on it, the VNC client that's web-based runs. I am now in this workstation, and I have a very limited visibility to that desktop. And you'll notice if I move my mouse over, I lose the mouse. I am a viewer only. I can only observe here the status of this HMI. I cannot interact with it, but you'll notice I have not passed any specific credentials to the remote VNC server. That was handled by the platform at NEX. The administrator has defined that my identity can only have viewer role, which VNC supports, for this specific area of the desktop. Therefore, I have no means of interacting with this, but I can monitor it at will. I can resize it, I can make it bigger like the VNC client allows me to, but I cannot interact with this. Now I have a different set of people. I may want to let them have operator role, but in this case, I don't have to, and I've not been granted such role. I can close now and go back to my portal and then observe that I have a second HMI, the full panel HMI, which is very similar, but this one is a different geography, and I have been granted read-write access to this one. When I click on it, I still fire up my VNC client. Now I see a slightly different panel. Now notice my mouse here allows me to toggle switches. So when I look at this XV50 switch valve here, I can both close it and open it. So I can open it, turns yellow, and I can close it, and it becomes closed again. I can even adjust things like the temperature set points here in this HMI. I have control over this part of the desktop. This is also a multi-user shared session. Someone else, a coworker, could be granted view only and observe me at the same time. So this is fairly common in VNC. What I've done though is I've really made different sets of permissions for different identities. Now let's say, for example, I want to reduce this here. This HMI, I have the interaction, I've reduced the temp set point. I've demonstrated now that I have some limited controls over an HMI over a second portion of the workstation. The third one is the temperature HMI. Again, this is a viewer-only role that I've been assigned by the administrator. I can see yet a third portion of that workstation. Now that I have my identity, I have this resource that is tied to a view-only role, and I can open it up, and now I will have access to only the temperature settings. I can refresh it here. I have the temperature settings of this set point that I was setting prior. So you see a couple seconds ago here, I raised the temperature setting and I lowered it back down. And now I have visibility into this graph. I may have overlay information that I might be able to see, but in general, this is the only view that I have of this desktop. I've now effectively made 3 HMIs visible in a single workstation. I have the ability to implement different roles for different identities people can view or people can interact with it, depending entirely on their identity that they've submitted. And even though I have not shared these passwords for the VNC component with these end users, I have a full audit of who is accessing which HMI at what time. I know that, for example, in this case, nick.stpierre@gmail.com has accessed 3 HMIs in a row, and I have irrefutable records for my risk management, compliance, or governance platform of who's accessing what and when. No need for a VPN here. I have the full identity of the users. So when we look at this now, I have been able to show 3 different HMIs on a workstation, and I have segmented it by user in the platform. So let's go back to our deck here. So we'll stop sharing and look at what we've done. We've gone and we've seen exactly who came in the profile. I've signed it with my Gmail account. I was then granted access to 3 HMIs after I provided my multi-factor authentication. In this case, I unlocked my Android phone. By clicking on each individual resource, I was projected inside the secure network. The connector gave me access to a specific area of the workstation to look at an HMI in a water treatment plant scenario. And these HMIs could be completely air-gapped because the connector locally has access to them. If you have any questions, please do reach out to me. I love doing these platform showcase, new use cases, new questions. It gives us a lot of good ideas to implement a demonstration of. The platform is very flexible. If you'd like to trial it, it's very easy as well. Typically takes about 20-30 minutes to deploy a connector under your own organization. There's no integration with shared identity providers, for example, that comes out of the box. So contact me, nick@agilicus.com. You can also reach our general sales line at info@agilicus.com and reach any one of us. But I appreciate your time today. Again, I'm Nicholas. I'm Chief Technology Officer here at Agilicus, and thank you very much for your attendance today.